coming. Thank you for flying in. Thank you for not commanding this is entirely because he's committed to helping foster the startup scene here, and entirely part of Google's commitment and Google Ventures' commitment to coming and being with us here this evening. So we really appreciate it. So those of you who have been here before kind of know the drill. We're going to start off looking at why he became an entrepreneur and a founder, and a little bit about that life journey. Then we're going to get into some of what's going on, some tips and pointers. Then finally we'll talk about trends that are going on with venture capital. And as soon as we get through the first little bit, we'll try to do questions and have as fluid a conversation as possible as we can with 90 people. But first, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, Kingston, time in Kingston, clearly you decided before you went to Amazon that you were going to be a startup success story. What kicked that off? Where does the spark come from?
It's tough to say. Do you ever get that sense that either the world's crazy or I'm crazy? For a long time I believed that I was crazy, and then I started to believe actually the world was crazy. It seemed like there was just a lot of obvious problems that, I and a group of peers I trusted completely had fantastic ideas about how to solve, or at least not terrible ideas about how to solve. So I think the first thing was actually taking a step back and saying, you know what, even though in the ecosystem at the time, I didn't have a lot of peers who I could point to and say, oh, there's a dude just like me who's done it. I started to get this idea that, maybe other people who feel like our peers in these other ecosystems actually are not that different than us. So I think that first realization that, there are a lot of other folks doing important things and having ideas that don't totally suck, maybe I'm one of those people as well.
Was there a particular influence, a person, or was there also maybe something going on in Kingston or something in Waterloo that set you off on the journey, or is it really just it's like, hey, this isn't that hard, I can do it?
Yeah, I think one feeling we've all had is saying, hey, wouldn't something be better this way, and then seeing it come to pass. And then we all tell our friends and family, oh, I had that idea first, I thought of Groupon, whatever. When that happens a certain number of times, you're like, okay, I'm obviously foolish if I keep not acting. So I think having seen that a few times in the market, I was like, all right, time to actually do something, or at least start discussing with my peers what it would mean to do something.
Right.
Yeah.
We were talking earlier today just about the journey, and one of the things that popped up was really not focusing sort of on Social Deck, which you can talk about as well, but what were the stories between graduation and Social Deck that probably tell us much about the character that it takes to succeed?
It's a strange thing, actually. So I was reading my bio today, and I realized that it reads like it's someone else's bio. That's like a bunch of highlights from an arc that had as many valleys as it had peaks, certainly. I was a poor student. Scott, one of my old Waterloo roommates, is here. He can tell you I was not the most fantastic student. Spent a glorious 6 years trying to graduate from Waterloo.
I'm a 5-year man myself.
So all of that was very trying. And then leading up to Social Deck, we failed over and over again. So probably the year that I decided, it's time to actually start acting on all this startup talk was late 2006. At that time, Y Combinator was just kicking off, and we were in this slight lull from an ecosystemic perspective. We had the Web 2.0 thing, YouTube was a fantastic success, but outside of that, it didn't feel like there was a lot of game-changing things happening in the ecosystem. So we initially started out with some ideas that were a little bit meandering, thinking about new ways to syndicate written content on the web, starting to think through strange things like image search via feature phone cameras, really grasping at straws. And this really led me to one of my fundamental beliefs, which is that markets are greater than teams, are greater than products. The market is the rising tide, and if the market is not enabling the opportunities, it becomes orders of magnitude harder to actually innovate. So I think for us, the actual breakthrough moment from a market perspective was the Facebook API. If you looked at what it did, besides creating a massive new distribution channel, it actually created a whole new class and category of application. And Friends for Sale was a prototypical example of here's something that simply would not have been possible without the social API. So that combination of a massive distribution channel that opened up, along with a new category of application that could be built, was really interesting. So that probably happened mid-2007. Along the way, we applied to Y Combinator every time. We got rejected every time. Actually, we went for interviews every time and then got rejected 3 times, which somehow was worse. You know, and that really is what catalyzed leaving Amazon. I think that it's a story I've told many times, but the very last time we went to pitch, we were pitching this software that connected to a glucose meter and basically would pull down all of your data and graph it. It's supposed to be this amazing disease management thing for diabetics that would change the world. You know, what I told my co-founder was, look, we're going to go in there, I'm going to bleed for this pitch, and there's no way they won't find us. So, you know, we went in, I pricked my finger, we measured it, and charted everything, I bled, and they're like, sorry man, not good enough. What do you want from me?
Does that make you a harder VC now?
That's way harder. You're not bleeding, you're not trying hard. So, I think that's just when we had, and I love YC, and maybe I'll speak to that later. It's a fantastic program, fantastic people, but I think that experience was a realization that if we're wrong, let the market tell us we're wrong, not investors. And investors are just people with an opinion. So, the question is, whose opinion really matters? And in many cases, it's the market, it's the product, it's the people who are using the product. And after that third, strike, we just decided that, if we're wrong, we'd be wrong in the market. So there was a lot of failures. We tried to launch this Facebook dating app that we're then trying to solve our own problems. You basically meet people. It turns out it's much more effective just to go to the bar and talk to girls.
6 years in university, it's like when you said it was a trying period, you were trying anything.
That's right. Basically looked at your social graph and would connect friends of friends, etc. And many things fell on their face before we left our jobs to start Social Deck.
So there's the dating thing. There was
image search, syndication
diabetic
content, diabetic disease management software. There was this group buying idea. Those are only the ones that come to mind.
So is this you and a co-founder the whole time?
Yeah.
Yeah. What was
His name is Jason.
Jason. So, and so how many people here have a startup? And how many people have been through a failed startup? And how many people have been through 2 failed startups? And how many people have been through 3? Yeah, 4? No, but I guess you can get my point, right? I mean, that's that kind. Now, what about what you take from one story and add, how did you get there? Not because of just the market, but because of how you learn to approach it.
I think the thing is that ideas are free, so it doesn't matter if you have an idea. And the work starts when you launch. There's no way to intuit what the eventual product that you're supposed to build actually is. You just need to start at A with a set of ideas, which probably are just okay, and start iterating towards B, and that's how you get there. That's why, we had these ideas of building something, launching it, day 0, it goes viral, it's crazy, we're high-fiving, rich, and none of that happens at all. With Social Deck, I used to call my parents and tell them how many active users we had, and I distinctly remember calling my dad and being like, Dad, 15 people are playing our games. You didn't tell me that 5 of them were my direct family members. That's where we started, and we grew it. We doubled every week and every week thereafter, and I think in February of 2009, when we closed our funding round, we had several 100,000 monthly active users. So, that's how you...
Sorry, how long?
It's less than a year.
Less than a year.
Yeah.
Okay. So you, how many people here report their user uptake to their dad? Yeah. Okay. I thought that would be a lot more. Even if your dad doesn't know what that means.
Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but still, right? I mean, that's interesting insight. But let's focus on the experience with Social Deck, or what you see now as the kinds of tactical or the kinds of strategies that companies need to take to cut through the noise, to make it to tackle the distribution challenge.
Yeah. If you take a look at it, the distribution channels really have not kept up. If you look at Yahoo in the 90s, they had this very quaint little list of all the websites that you needed to know about for a given category. So you went to sports, there was 20 sports websites. Those are probably the only 20 sports websites that really mattered on the web. And then, obviously, an explosion of information on the web. Google came along and disrupted that distribution channel through search. It disrupted the taxonomy-based system. If you look at the way that mobile apps are distributed today, we're still stuck in that taxonomy-based system, and it just doesn't scale. You go to iTunes, if you actually look at the distribution spread, you've got these massive fat head spreads with the top 50, top 20, top 10, top 100 dominating in distribution. And the platforms, and Google's guilty of this as well, have not actually kept up with the amount of information that's available. There's a big, I think independent of this, there's a big opportunity there. So that being said, with a sort of finite supply and an ever-increasing demand, how do you actually drive awareness and distribution? I think understanding what your metrics really are is key, and not focusing on the incorrect metrics as much as focusing on the correct metrics. So an incorrect metrics that a metric that I see frequently is total number of downloads, which doesn't matter as much as active users. So from a tactical perspective, what's the most high leverage way to drive your active user count? A lot of it is actually through investments in retention versus new distribution. So if you think about it, the funnel, investing in actually bringing users to the top of the funnel is pointless if it's leaking like a sieve. So the highest leverage ways you can actually often drive active user count is things like your out-of-box flow. Like for everyone here that has a startup, do you actually sign up as a new user every single day? That's what you should be doing, because that's the first experience that new users have with your product. But as a founder, it's the experience that we're least exposed to and the least trained to understand from the new user's perspective. It's a huge point of leverage there. You actually look at engagement and also frequency of use. Like for something to actually become a habit and to become an app that people use, they need to actually have a reason to use it frequently enough. Monthly is not enough, bi-weekly is not enough, weekly is at a very minimum how much they need to use it. So ensuring that you measure retention on a weekly basis and ensuring that you're actually doing things to drive users into the app weekly is key. So these types of things are, you need to focus on, so we have our output, which is active user count. What are the actual inputs that drive that output, and what's the highest leverage problem for me to solve?
And, you've got the opportunity to see a lot of deal flow. What are maybe the 2 or 3 things that you might want to do?
Let's see. So I think local services is actually super interesting. So, getting a plumber is a terrible experience. It's a terrifying experience perhaps. Finding them on Yelp, trying to coordinate with them, making sure that they show up on time, there's no feedback loop. It feels like getting a taxi 5 years ago. So why hasn't anyone solved that problem?
So Mars had a couple, or at least Mars had a startup like that, right?
That's what we're solving. That's the problem.
What's the name of the company? Yeah, what's the name of the company? Go ahead, stand up.
My dad is a lawn irrigation contractor, and I've been helping him since I was 13 years old. And I graduated in school, and he always said, basically, stay in school, make sure you do your work, and don't do what I did. And it's tough for contractors, and really what I set out to do was solve that problem with mobile technology. And it's been 4 years in the making. I know that the first part of that is really about the contract, making their life really easy. And then the second part of that is the consumer. So it's a JBB Mobile. Shitty name, I know. But JBB stands for Just Business to Business, and the app that we're releasing on the Salesforce App Exchange very soon is called Field Cloud. So go for it.
Got a checkbook?
There's also Hammurati.
Hammurati is what I was thinking of. Have you heard of that? Yeah.
Actually, so that's great, and we should talk after. I think that that's the exact right approach. Like, building marketplaces is really hard, so first you want to drive supply and then drive demand. And the way to drive supply in a way that the plumber doesn't just use you as lead gen is actually to build a set of tools that integrates you into their workflow. Right. And this is not just for the local services space, it's for any marketplace opportunity.
Yeah, so Salesforce is a great place to be. Go ahead.
So for marketplaces, like chicken and the egg,
Yeah.
and for a business, saying like, imagine like Yelp.
Yep.
They all say at the beginning you need to do brute force to kind of get it going. And so it leads to doing things that are in field and like physical. but we all know that the world now is digital and inbound marketing, all that stuff. Where is your opinion on if businesses or like SaaS companies should try and build the way they see themselves building when they're bigger, or if they should be doing things differently at the beginning to get themselves going, that when they're down the road they won't be doing?
Yeah, I mean, marketplaces are hard. I think your tactics have to change over time. So one thing you can do and you should do is seed the marketplace with your own supply if you can. So in the local services example, if we're expanding to, Seattle, and we actually have a hard time convincing contractors in the supply side to come on board, I would just hire 5 contractors or give them a guaranteed weekly minimum to be a part of the platform until you can actually, create enough activity that it's self-sustaining. So I think that definitely is a hard problem, and there are a completely different set of tactics for the early side versus the late side. The late side is actually all about preventing the supply from using you as lead gen and then doing side deals. I think it's a problem that TaskRabbit has. If I get a handyman on TaskRabbit, I really have no incentive to basically say, dude, all right, forget about TaskRabbit, you work for me now. Versus the early stage part of that business where it's like, well, why would I bother to list my services on your platform if there is no guarantee of demand?
So when you're trying to charge the businesses for the service you're providing, you want to offer for free at the beginning, where do you feel that tipping point is? Where now you can say, okay, now I can go back to all the businesses that I've been letting use the profile to create some content, to create supplies. Yeah. What is that point that you found in the past to say, okay, now we can start charging? I'm going to lose some people, but I need to get going.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you're generating new demand for them, then they're going to be willing to pay you a portion of the uplift in their business. And I think you need to set that expectation from day one. And if you're an alternative channel for their existing demand, it's a lot harder to actually make that argument. So I focus on helping them grow their business versus facilitate a more frictionless interaction with their existing business.
So I think I understand. I think I understand the paid search model and how you generate revenue and so on in Google. But how do you rationalize something like Tumblr that had $1 billion valuation with pretty much no sales? How do you rationalize that?
I mean, it's interesting because I just personally wrapped a big look at the ad tech ecosystem, which is, to answer your earlier question, another area that I'm interested in. And when you look at it, all of the value actually accrues to the publishers. So the best place to be in that ecosystem, the most defensible place, is the publisher, and then significantly less so someone that owns the advertiser relationship. So I actually think that the number of impressions they're generating is massively valuable, and with the data overlay that Yahoo can provide, I think it's actually going to be an economic buy for them. Yeah, it's the same reason that Twitter is worth so much. I mean, it's ultimately a massive publisher.
So it's not an ad revenue thing.
It is.
It overlays the data network.
Well, I think that Yahoo will drive more value from that inventory than Tumblr would alone, because they've got a lot of data sources.
Right, okay.
They will monetize it through ads, but I think it's actually worth it for that inventory.
Okay.
So. Plus, Marissa's kind of a badass. I mean, we're all going for it, right?
So, ad tech, location services,
Yeah.
and
So television is still super early, but it's pretty eye-watering if you look at the amount of engagement, the number of ad dollars, the lack of sophistication, and how those ad dollars is actually measured. I'm sure most people already know this, but Nielsen does these panels where they phone 30 people and then they extrapolate that to millions. Of course, I'm exaggerating, but the entire way that ecosystem is structured is, to not be rude, ripe for innovation. So I'm definitely interested in that. And also, we can't have a screen that big that's that central in so many of our homes and have it not be smarter. I mean, it's broadcast still, which is crazy. Even with celebrities, which is the ultimate form of broadcast, or traditionally was in the past, there's actually this conversation going on now. So it seems surprising that that whole medium is still subject to broadcast.
and the content is terrible. Go ahead.
Hi, Anish.
Hey.
What's your name?
My name is David Meadow. I'm actually founder of my own startup, Shield.com. Right now we're in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign, so we're looking for funding.
What's the name of the company again?
Geo.com.
Speak Geo is in the middle of a Kickstarter campaign.
Yeah, it was a Kickstarter and help support us.
So in the same way that any firm would exercise a certain amount of diligence with their limited partner based on the characteristics of certain deals, we would do the same thing with Right Proper.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I just wanted to ask, what happened with the diabetes monitoring application? Was it a YC thing, or what?
No, so when we actually looked at it, so I still thought we were going to build that after YC. When we looked at it and what the hard problems were we had to solve, a lot of them were sort of systemic, like, trying to sell through healthcare institutions, convince doctors. It's kind of scary to build a product where if you're wrong, someone gets hurt by it. I mean, I'm like, what, if the game crashes, it's all good, but I don't know. Yeah, so I think when we looked at what are the hard problems and what are the ones we're interested in solving, almost none of them were in that space. I still think it's a fantastic area of opportunity, and there's a bunch of companies like Blue Coat that are working on it, and I take my hat off to them. I mean, it's pretty shocking the way that disease is managed when you consider the scale. So.
My name's William Rose, and I teach marketing at Jordan Brown and been involved in technology. I started teaching. Speaking of local services, this one just burns my butt, but we don't have a better way to do it. When is somebody going to do something meaningful in the real estate marketplace and get rid of like 6% commissions for guys that list it, put it on the internet, and the buyers show up?
Yeah, I mean, there's a bunch of folks trying. I agree with you. It seems like a business that stubbornly is not going away.
So is it Homestars that has a bit of a toehold in this locally? Go ahead.
Yeah. People talk about big data. Yeah. So what do you think the big data will impact the market and companies?
So maybe I can help shape that question a little bit as well.
Okay.
And maybe let's talk about a data-driven approach, which is, we've read a lot about Google Ventures and how they're changing venture capital. And so you can perhaps talk about big data in a broader sense, but also in a particular context.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to speak to your specific question, I think everyone's measuring everything now where they should be, and the interesting opportunities in big data are not in the capture of it. There's some stuff around the management of it, but rather the interpretation of it. Making sure that every stakeholder and every decision maker in the company is seeing the right data and understands what the data actually means. Also denormalizing the data, so like averages are always the nightmare, the enemy of good decision making. You need to understand, like looking at the scatter plot of data, where the sort of concentration lies. So actually starting to break out of some of that type of reporting and that type of, those sets of metrics as the basis for decision making is important. And I think, we grew up in a system that, at least for me, emphasized calculus over statistics. Calculus is, closed solutions, and statistics is sort of probabilistic. I think that's also one of the reasons that many of us, or at least myself, had to spend some time investing in understanding statistics. I think as a business community, we're getting better at that. In terms of Google Ventures and big data, I mean, look, Google Ventures is made up of folks from Google, and the DNA of Google is extremely data-driven. So a lot of the investments that we actually make are in companies that are not necessarily solving a data problem, because effectively every company is solving a data problem. Rather have a culture and a rigor around data that is thoughtful. And that's happening increasingly, but it's still not every company. I would like to see 100% of the companies that we see, 100% of the deal flow have a strong data culture.
I thought, just to recap or kind of highlight one of the things that you said there is that decision-making made based upon averages is flawed. I mean, that can actually is kind of a summary of venture capital investing traditionally, right? I mean, whether it's an average of sort of a community point of view or a gatekeeper point of view, or three white guys sitting around a table on a Monday afternoon, that's been the traditional model. So what is the, there's Google Ventures, there's what's going on with Andreessen. How many firms are leading the way to a way more sensible approach to decision making? What percentage of the industry? And is it going to happen here?
Yeah, well, there's a lot of interesting dynamics in the industry. So the fundamental hypothesis that Google Ventures has had is similar to the one that Andreessen had, which is build a firm that we ourselves would have wanted as entrepreneurs. You look at our team, we've got almost 50 people focused on working with the portfolio full time: design, recruiting, marketing, engineering. So that's a big, very tangible asset that the portfolio can actually leverage, and Andreessen is doing a lot of this too. I think we're starting to see many other firms start to invest in this capability. I would talk to other entrepreneurs and really hold them to it, because things like AngelList, which maybe we'll touch on later, capital is increasingly commodified, and I think the story of strategic cooperation between companies in the portfolio, I personally haven't. There are some interesting opportunities, but everyone's so focused on their own thing that it's hard to facilitate that. Whereas, every company, especially in the early stage side, has a weakness in, PR and marketing, design, recruiting. One of those three things, it's uncommon to find a company that's strong in all of them. So I think that kind of very tangible help at the early stage, it's just a stronger story around how we help versus, the sort of lofty strategic alignment within the portfolio.
So that's tangible value add stuff.
Yeah.
So what about data? What about, do you think that you have a significant, I know you probably can't sort of say, okay, well, here's our approach, but do you think that there's a real big difference between the decision-making process at Google, or let's say what Paul Singh is working on with Dasio? I don't know, are you familiar with that? And what they're building inside at, I think Reid Hoffman's building something as well. So they're all building some sort of analytics platform on a proprietary basis. And do you see that VCs are going to do that globally? Or?
I can't speak to what others are doing or even details what we're doing in that space, but it makes sense. There's more data that's better structured than there ever has been before. And with AngelList, you've got this new platform on which we can start to imagine a world perhaps where VCs are making investments programmatically. So, in the same way that we've seen efficiencies in financial markets driven by these connecting platforms, it's also conceivable that can happen in our industry. We haven't seen it to date. So I think we're at, it's far too early to actually, venture is a hard thing to measure generally because, it takes 7 years for a typical fund to close. A lot of the companies that are failing fail first, the good ones succeed later. So, to actually close the loop and understand how your strategy is performing is a tough thing to do, especially, when you're trading equities, it's obviously a much tighter loop. So, hard set of problems, too early to tell, but something that we'll undoubtedly see more of.
So we're going to come back for a second, but we're on AngelList, so let's just touch upon it. So, I don't know if everybody read this, but yesterday, AngelList announced a financing of $24 million at a valuation of around $150 million. Google Ventures is part of that. There's 150 investors participating in it. Many of the biggest VC firms in the United States and many of the super angels. So there are, how many people are familiar with AngelList? Okay. I think it's an important development for Canadian startups. Certainly some better Canadian startups have had success on AngelList already. So there's AngelList just as a platform to begin with, but then there's also at the same time these two announcements or two new innovations of about a month old: syndicates and backers. So do you want to just kind of tackle kind of the implications of these three things quickly from your point of view? Now, this is, by the way, with your own hat on, not necessarily with your Google Ventures hat.
Absolutely, yeah. So, I think the innovation is a really interesting one. We talked about this earlier today, which is we saw what happened when the distribution channels got democratized in other areas. So first, the democratization of the arts, music, etc. We saw with iTunes, SoundCloud, self-publishing, removing those artificial barriers to distribution. Of course, we've seen the barriers come down in terms of distribution of information on the web, distribution of information through apps, and there's been massive change. And I think it's hard to argue that it has not been at least interesting, and I think it's actually been for the best. So the barriers are starting to come down now for individuals to start funding these opportunities. The Jobs Act was huge, and I think why not? I think it's a positive development, and I think it's going to lead to some interesting decision making, some interesting companies being funded. I think from a syndication perspective, From a backing perspective, this now becomes that next step where, okay, we've democratized access to funding, now we're democratizing the business model as well. So I think venture capital as an industry needs to think long and hard about what the implications are for them.
How many people know what syndicates are? Okay, so so the lead investor can take a 20% carry now and then allocate out to his own network of investors or his or her own network of investors. Go ahead.
Sure, Kamal from VentureLinks, platform for entrepreneurial ecosystems. We're doing a funding contest we'll be announcing next Monday for entrepreneurs. So it's VentureLinks. Personal question for you. You've been an entrepreneur, you're a VC now. A lot of times on the entrepreneur side, it looks really envious to be a VC, like great salary, good upside, etc., a lot of fun. What's the downside of being a VC? What should we as entrepreneurs feel happy we don't have to do that you do?
You can say there is no downside.
It's all the fancy wine and the wood-fired pizzas. No. I mean, the downside is it's hard to be a coach and not a player. It's the feeling of satisfaction of actually building something, thinking of something, building it, launching it, and watching how it changes behavior or it doesn't is incredibly rewarding. And it's really hard to actually disconnect yourself from that, which is why I think we see a lot of VCs kind of step into the VC world and then, sort of bounce back out to work on something operational. I think the incredible thing about it is getting to see a wide breadth of opportunities and a wide breadth of leadership styles. It's really cool. But not building is tough.
Okay, we can't jump over Google Plus. You got to tell us some highlights, how you got in that role, and what were some of the highlights from that?
Google Plus is interesting. It's interesting to see a big company who's the incumbent in so many areas not be the incumbent. So it's interesting to be a part of a scrappy startup within Google that's trying to do social. And social is not something that Google has traditionally done. So that actually was an interesting set. It's an interesting cultural problem or opportunity within the company to actually convince folks that this is an important problem for the company to solve. And I think this is something that I love most about Google, which is that they never really get too complacent. They realize that there's a threat, they realize that there's other companies that are rising, and they work very actively to ensure we're investing in what matters, not just yesterday, today, but tomorrow. So social was identified as one of those areas, and after a few missteps, I think we found our footing. So it was interesting to actually advocate for the effort within the company, number one. Number two, it's interesting to go from building a product where you're fighting tooth and nail for every user to building a product where it can be linked to the biggest distribution engine in the world, which is Google Search. The one thing I learned there is that you fight a lot harder for a 10% uplift on 1,000 users than you do for a 10% uplift on 1 million users. So not allowing the data to obfuscate your focus and still push really hard, push for day over day, week over week, normalize to a user growth versus just looking at the raw numbers and high-fiving and saying, there was 1 million photos uploaded today, 1 million's a big number. Like, that doesn't matter. So having that product rigor is actually tough in a big company.
Normalized to the user.
So.
Okay, go ahead.
2 questions. What brings you to Toronto, aside from this, of course? And what's the most exciting investment you believe that you've had at Google Ventures, aside from Uber and AngelList?
So
did you work on the Uber deal?
First question, it was a team effort. The first question is an easy one. I'm here frequently for family and friends, and I obviously maintain close ties to the ecosystem as well. So I was overdue for a trip, that's why I'm here, and of course to do this fantastic event. The second question, what's the most exciting? It's really hard to say what are the most exciting companies. You look at a company like Foundation Medicine, which we're a big investor and just IPO today. It's a fundamentally different approach to how we're thinking about cancer. I don't know as much about the life science space. In fact, I don't know much at all. But I know as someone who one day will die, I'm interested in elongating my life. So that seems like an interesting problem and an important problem for us to solve. I think something like that, on that end of the spectrum, right over to something like Nest, which is such an interesting company founded by such a strong team that, that maybe actually has a crack at putting smart devices in the home after seeing many, many dead bodies on the side of the road in that space. So, and then, of course, on the early stage side, so we've got a big portfolio. Hard to pick. You know, no parent has favorite children, but there's some interesting.
How many companies in the portfolio?
There's about 180.
And how many deals will you do into a year?
I think it varies. I mean, it has varied to date, and it will continue to vary. As we think about scaling the fund, you know, investing team is still relatively small. You've seen us do some bigger deals, so I think you'll start to see a push towards bigger deals. But you know, to date, we probably by volume done the largest number of like seed and Series A.
Right.
So
How many?
about 180 total.
No, but in the course of a year, how many deals will you do?
Well, how long has it been around?
Yeah, so
Yeah,
we've been around
over
since
what?
2009.
Okay.
So 3 into 180? It's as simple
More
as
this
that.
year.
Oh, actually, there was a bigger.
Okay, all right. Doesn't matter.
That's all it is.
Since you've had the perspective from a consumer and app focused perspective, how significant would you say the difference is if you're starting Social Deck as an example or something like that in Toronto versus San Francisco? How big or small does that
Yeah.
go?
That's a good question. So I think one thing that's tough to find in Toronto is the same maturity in terms of product leadership. So I think that's something that we benefited a lot from spending extended time periods in the Valley from. And also we developed a bunch of that rigor ourselves. I think it's really important to learn from your peers, learn from people who have been there before you. So I think on the consumer product side in particular, it's an area where it's harder to connect with the right people in Toronto, and for that part of our business, being in San Francisco was certainly better. But look, like anyone can launch an app in any one of the app stores. You know, the tactics that we use to drive distribution are not geographically fragmented. So in many ways, it's a more open market than it ever has been before, and there's no reason that a company from Toronto can't be a breakout in any of these segments.
When you were a founder, would you have answered the question the same way? Because I'm sorry, but I hear when a venture capitalist answers this question in Toronto, they say, well, we need better teams. And when founders answer this question, we need more visionary VCs.
Well, we should all just talk about it.
That's what we're doing.
I don't know, would I answer the question the same way? I'm not sure. Look, it's tough to build things here, especially when there's this whole mind share piece that is hard to capture here. Look, I think you can build a great business and a great product. You need to have a strong presence in the Valley. It's something that we invested in. It's something I wish we had invested more in. And look, there's no reason that any of those entrepreneurs are more sophisticated than we are. They just have a culture where they're constantly interacting with each other. And we need to both create that culture and section off for their culture. So.
Go ahead.
Are there any particular startups coming out of Toronto that you have your eyes on?
Well, I can tell you a few that I'm excited
Could you
about.
say that right into the camera, by the way? This is being recorded.
Look, I think that Wattpad is one of my favorites. Incredible, I know. It's strange because I never thought that, it just didn't occur to me that there was a desire for self-expression through writing and stories in the same way that there is through video and photos and all the other mediums. We stopped creative writing in 7th grade or grade 8 or whatever, and just never picked it up again, and yet there's this incredibly vibrant community there, so I think that's pretty rad. The culture of that product, the scale is obviously eye-watering. It's a cool company. I guess I'll do a plug for Relay. Messenger is pretty cool. I think Vine has shown that there's this strong precedent for apps that distribute that kind of content and help you create it. And video is still pretty uncracked. We've seen a million the Instagram of video. It turns out Instagram is the Instagram of video. But I still think mobile video is an interesting area. And those guys are kind of speaking to that.
Go ahead.
Would you be able to speak to how you select a partner? Because obviously each firm has strengths and weaknesses. If you're looking for a partner and they bring money to the table, sometimes it's not really the money you need. You kind of need somebody who's like, we get what you're going to do. Have you thought about this type of particular partner? It's great that you're in Toronto, but you really need to go to Shanghai, you really need to be in Acharya, you need to be in Johannesburg, well, that's where you should launch your product. It's not necessarily in the map.
Yeah, I mean, I think realizing that it's the individual partner at the firm you're going to work with as much as or more so than the firm. Like, the firm has resources and that's awesome, and it's great to high five your friends and having had raised money from Kleiner. But who's the person who's actually going to be on those weekly one-on-ones with you? So I think setting expectations with your investor is really important. Like, I want to do weekly one-on-ones. Here are the areas of weakness that I have personally. Here are the areas of weakness for the company. Is this something that you feel like you can help us out with? And feeling that that individual actually is going to grow you as an entrepreneur and help you grow your business in these areas of weakness is super critical. So I think a lot of it is about the individual, where there's been an overemphasis put sometimes on the firm.
Right, and I've heard someone say when you get with an investor, whether it's angel or C or B or whatever, it's really not about the money, it's really what they bring to the table.
Yeah, I mean, of course, money's nice too.
Money's nice.
No, it is. It's super important. And, managing those expectations, like advisors. I find advisors is a big, boondoggle for a lot of startups because they don't manage those advisors. And I'm an advisor for some companies, and I expect them to manage me. Like, tell me what you need, get time on my calendar, let's work on those problems. Otherwise, I'm not going to pull. And for investors, it's the same thing. Like, make sure you're managing your investors and getting what you need from them. It's not a sign of weakness to say, I need help filling my sales pipeline.
So take us into the weekly one-on-one. Just give me a quick snapshot of what that call looks like.
Yeah, I mean, I think first of all, it depends on if that's something that the entrepreneur wants. A lot of entrepreneurs want to be left alone and build, and I think that's fine. Interactions at the board time are okay. The weekly one-on-one, I think, is extremely tactical, extremely operational. Like, look, how do we interview a VP of Eng? Do we need a growth hacker? What does that even mean? How do we manage a specific PR situation? And that's not always a problem that I know how to solve. In fact, often it isn't, but I can help get folks involved that know how to solve it. Disaster planning, it's something that Google knows intimately. It's something that no startup ever thinks about, but if you're a startup that Dropbox, it's pretty important to understand what happens when the 100-year flood hits. And these are the types of tactical questions that I think are most important to cover.
Okay, we're winding down here. So if there's, this is sort of the last final call. If you came here to ask a question, make sure you get your hand up and get what you need and what you came for. Go ahead.
So this is I probably should have asked it after he asked this question about big data, but so you mentioned a couple of things about data being data-driven and how that's important for companies. But it's interesting when you said, a lot of companies are missing things like marketing and hiring, and I forget what the third one was, none of which are
HR.
data. HR, there you go. So only marketing maybe around growth hacking, right, which you said with a quotations tone. Do you feel that sort of the fetishization of data, metrics, optimizing things like this, have they damaged a lot of these sort of founders who are very, very metrics oriented, but not sort of product or design oriented? Or do you feel sort of the A-listers who make it to your table are okay?
Yeah, so I think that the fetishization of data, as you call it.
Like O'Reilly, big data, the whole conference.
Of course, and that's absolutely true. So I think the important thing, at least the way I look at it, is that data can help give you an uplift. Let's call it like a 20 or a 25% uplift or depression, depending on what you're doing with it. But the fundamental trajectory is not set by data. You can't iterate your way to a product. You can't start with the metrics and start building a product from that. So design, which is probably the most important function, that we didn't realize was very critical 5 years ago. The same way that you once needed a CTO, you still do, you now need someone that actually is going to show a lot of leadership in design. So I think design and product and fundamental vision, of course, is what is going to set the trajectory, and then using the data in a wise way is what's going to actually increase the acceleration. That's how I think about it.
And do you think that a lot of founders don't realize the second part? Sorry, founders.
Don't realize the second part? Well,
that the product comes first or the design comes first. Have you had to teach that lesson, or is it not been a problem?
I don't think so. No, I think the bigger gap is on understanding the data rather than having we all have ideas and hypotheses. That comes much more naturally to us than saying, don't show me the average retention, show me a scatter plot of retention.
So, Jeff Folds from Affinity, it's a startup that's looking at workflow issues and closing gaps in interactive content creation for video games and structural engineering, kind of two different domain spaces. You're talking about situations where you've got an investment where it's going to either works and hurt somebody, or pardon me, if it doesn't work and hurt somebody, or if it doesn't work, you just reboot the server. How do you look at those two different deals, assuming that everything else is all the same? And how would you rank which one would be the better deal to put your money to?
A deal in which there's like a mission critical application that, yeah, I don't.
Everything else is the same, it's just one is
Yeah.
mission critical.
I mean, I don't look, at the end of the day, the founders, all of the things that drive the decision-making process are going to be, I think, independent of that characteristic of the investment. Ultimately, VCs are here to return, and if we believe there's a fantastic team solving a mission-critical problem versus a non-mission-critical problem, it should all be the same to us. We're not we don't have an altruistic bent, and I think if you actually look at the investments that firms that have explicitly had that altruistic bent have returned, it's been underwhelming. So, no difference. This year we should get them at one point.
Okay. Just going back to your point about going to the Valley and the culture there. So one of our advisors advised us that instead of trying to go to another Canadian market, is to actually try and go into the States and test it out there.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really interesting because it's such a different beast. One, would you agree? And two, if you were, what would be your decision-making criteria? Would you go after like the big, well-known markets? Or would you try to do a more contrarian to say like, we did it here, so we can do it?
Yeah, I don't know if I'd go try to own the Arkansas market. So
Well, for example, Zuckerberg says, somebody said that they tried to do it in Boston first because if they failed in Boston.
yeah. I don't know, I mean, okay, a couple of points. So number one, I don't think that startups put each other out of business. I think that not finding product market fit is what most often causes companies to fail. So operating in an established market should not be a concern, at least not from a competitive perspective, maybe from a cost perspective. Second thing is, for businesses that are city local, the hardest problem that you have to solve is how to actually build a playbook for expanding city to city. So the question is, are you going to be most effectively able to iterate and solve that problem where your two cities are San Francisco and Toronto, separated by time zone, 6-hour flight, etc., or would you pick another two cities that are, closer physically? The third city, I think there's no question entering the U.S. market is important. I don't think that market's actually that different. I don't think it's very different at all, which is why, to take the contrarian approach, a lot of what we advise U.S. companies is do a lot of your distribution on the Canadian app store, Canadian ecosystem, because the market's so representative of the U.S. and all the costs are an order of magnitude lower. So.
The question is, when some people talk about startups, they say about building user base, sell that user base to Google, for example. And the other thing is that, right? So like sell the user base, right? Like,
yeah.
Do you look at that, or in terms of when you look at revenue models, do you a lot of people when I talk to say, we do advertising. Like that's a lot of the stuff that I get, or direct sales. Is there any interesting revenue models that you see, right? So is it more of you look at the user base or the revenue?
So a couple of things. I look at the growth, first of all. So even 1 million users that's stagnated is not that interesting. Second of all, I look at the unit economics. What's the cost of user acquisition? What's the lifetime value? Is there liquidity in the distribution channel? So does the actual cost of user acquisition scale? I think there's a lot of factors, but I do think we're living in a world where people are actually getting used to paying for stuff. Like Evernote does not ever have to have a conflict with the needs of their users from an advertising perspective, because they just say, look, we're going to charge you. And I think that model is pretty well accepted now, and if you can actually create enough value that people just pay you, it's fantastic. I would be careful about building a user base and selling it to Google. Google has a lot of users, and having built a business like that, I can tell you that it's like jumping off a cliff and building the plane on the way down. Right? You're like, I hope this plane is ready by the time we hit the ground. It's dangerous. So, really think through how your business sustains independently. And advertising, for example, something like audio advertising, a lot of that has to be direct sold. Like Pandora has a large direct sales force. You have to have massive scale to actually close those deals. So those models may not be scalable for your first 1 million users. You may need to get 10 million. So when you think about your story, think about how it makes sense for your first cohort of users as well as your million.
Okay, so it's time. It's 20 after 8. We asked you for an hour of your time. We appreciate the time that you've given us already. There's a couple of other thank yous that I'd like to thank Eric, who is doing the social media coverage there this evening. I'd like to thank David Lamb. Oh, David, who's doing the door. Motion still is doing the video capture. I still have, I'd also like to mention that there's a secret, kind of like a secret shopper program going on, in that VentureLinks is giving away a copy of the Startup Owner's Manual, and Kamal is going to select the person who asks the best question tonight. So he's going to, if you asked a question, go and see Kamal, who's right here, afterwards, because he's going to give away a book. Let's finish up with one more kind of, we talked about how Google Ventures and the data-driven approach is changing venture capital. We talked about the AngelList deal and the implications around that. You decided to be a founder in the US market versus the Canadian market. So maybe sort of do a summary of the trends that are shaping the North American market, and where Canada's at, what's going to take, what are the kind of things that how these trends are going to impact the folks in this room.
Yeah, things have changed drastically, certainly in the last 10 years, and even more so in the last 5 years. The rate of change in this ecosystem is accelerating, which is exciting. We need a bunch of things to actually make this place work. Number one, we need peers. We need to be able to look at other people who feel like future versions of ourselves and say, look, that dude went and did it, why can't I do it? So I think that's super critical, and we're seeing more and more of that. Obviously, from a funding perspective, I think the big gap in the past was early stage, and we've seen a bunch of awesome institutions set up to help solve that. I think there's a lot of room for growth in how mature we are around product. I think it's something that's super critical, and we're moving to a world where technology matters less. A lot of the technology is cheap and commodity. A lot of the hard problems that companies are solving are product, market, design problems. So we need to actually grow our ecosystem in that way. And then the late stage funding side, things are changing. I was at Andreessen's offices recently, and they were singing the praises of Waterloo and of the Canadian ecosystem more broadly. So while the number of deals we've seen is still relatively small, I think that's going to increase, and we're on the radar of these VCs. So things are going in the right direction. We're not there yet. It's still an immature ecosystem, and I encourage everyone here to spend a ton of time in the Valley. Go find out what they're up to, what's working, what's not. The benefit of being where we are is that we're not in the echo chamber, which the Valley certainly can be. So look, I think that we're heading in the right direction. I think we still have things to learn from the Valley, but the future is bright. We have a better opportunity to build $100 million, billion-dollar businesses here today than we've ever had before. So let's keep rolling.
Thank you very much. Google